Hello, it's Professor Cohn again. This week for HE111W, we are returning to short stories. We're going to be reading three quite different ones from the set of stories we read 2 weeks ago. Back then, we were getting started with the form, and the works that we read tended towards realism, towards sort of accurate, realistic, factual representations of the world. This week we are getting three stories that move away from that. The first one will be a work of science fiction. The other one will be a work of realism, but it will have a section that is quite different in terms of its representation of things. And then the third will be a sort of fabulist or surrealist kind of work. So the first of the stories we're reading is really one of my favorite short stories. It's by a woman named Octavia Butler. She was an African-American science fiction writer. And the story is called Bloodchild. And in this particular story, we have a setting that is foreign to us. It's not Earth, it's a different planet. And there are two different species, sentient species on this planet. One sentient species are called the Tlic. And don't worry about pronunciations. You may notice some names that don't seem familiar to you at all, but you're used to that from watching science fiction films. So don't be put off by it here. The Tlic are a fully sentient, fully conscious race. They seem to be insectoid, and I'm being pretty loose with that. You'll get a lot of descriptions of them having articulated joints and multiple legs per segment, etc. They certainly don't look human, but they can speak with humans and have the full range of emotions that we might associate with a person. The other species, of course, are humans, but here they're called Terrans. And it's important that you realize why they're called that. The Latin word terra means earth, and these humans are not on Earth itself. They're not on their home planet. They, in fact, have arrived here as aliens. And that's one of the first themes to recognize in the story, that Butler is giving us, she's overturning our sense of the familiar by making the characters we would naturally identify with the alien species. And the native species are the Tlic. And the humans, we find out, live not entirely freely. They live on what's called the preserve. And part of the reason we start to find out they live on this preserve is that when they first arrived at this planet, the Tlic overwhelmed them and began to use them as a species in which they could plant their eggs. So it turns out that the Tlic do not deliver their own children, but they implant eggs into living creatures, and then those eggs hatch and eat the host. And we find out that the Tlic race, the animals that they had been placing their eggs in previously, were rejecting the eggs. So the species was starting to die out. And then when the humans arrive, the Tlic see them as a new resource. And so for a period of time, the Terrans are treated terribly. But then there's a kind of political and social change, and some of the really important figures in the Tlic society move to start treating humans as persons rather than just as animals. But you'll notice that it's a limited personhood. So for instance, they're confined to the preserve, ostensibly to protect them. But they don't have freedom to leave it. They don't have freedom to use cars for transportation. We find out that they are not allowed to have firearms. We also find out that every family within the preserve has a Tlic individual who is associated with it. And as we find out, that is because the Tlic, who are the patrons for these families, are allowed to implant their eggs into one of the family members. In the spirit of overturning our expectations, Butler overturns gender expectations. In this story, it is the men who are the bearers of the eggs. And so she's giving us a kind of male pregnancy. It turns out that men their bodies are pretty well suited for this, but the other thing that is underlying that is that the Talik do not want to make the women in the human culture and the Terran culture give up their bodies so that they cannot reproduce their own offspring. So the men then become those who bear the children of the Talik. And as we sort of go through this story, we're following one main character. His name is Gan, and the story begins with the last night of his childhood. And what happens over the course of this story is effectively Gan's coming of age. And so as you read it, you should ask, what was the innocent Gan like? Like, what was his view of the world before the events of this story came about? And then how does he change? How does the world look different to him? How does he change as an individual as a result of these? His counterpart is a Talik named Tagatoi. And Tagatoi is planning to implant her eggs in Gan. And Gan, as we will see early on, buys into Talik culture. He buys into this whole process. He thinks it's a kind of noble thing to do. Although we will also see that the Talik have a kind of control over the Terrans that maybe we're not paying attention to as much as we should. They allow them to eat their unfertilized eggs, and these unfertilized eggs have a kind of narcotic effect on Terrans. And it becomes a way of subduing them, of making them more compliant. And so over time, what you should recognize, what you may start to feel as you're reading this, is that although this is a story about aliens in a different world, etc., it is to an extent reflective of a slave society. And although Butler herself, I think, tried at times to distance her short story from the story of American slavery, I think it's hard not to look at this and read it as a kind of a story, a small story about what it is like to be a slave, what it is like to be a slave in a society that tries to treat you in certain ways beneficially, but nevertheless still restricts you and doesn't see you entirely as an equal person. And a question that may arise by the end of the story is, what does it take to have genuine equality between different groups? And I think that the story gives us a kind of solution, but it's not a comfortable one. So the second story that we'll be reading is a really great story by Tobias Wolff called Bullet in the Brain. And the best way to sort of approach this story is to see that it is in two parts. And the first part is in present time. All right, so it's live time sequence. Our main character is a book reviewer, a book critic named Anders, and he is waiting in line at a bank when a bank robbery takes place. It's critical to know about Anders. You'll read Wolff's description of him this way. Anders is weary of everything. He's a tired, cynical, embittered man. And his being a book critic has a lot to do with that. The idea, I think, is that he's read so much literature. He's seen so many artistic works and heard so many stories that they're all starting to sound alike to him. And so, for you, perhaps the first time you read a story, it may be unfamiliar, and while that may be off-putting, it may also be exciting, because there's the prospect of discovery. Discovery no longer exists for Anders. Anders has seen it all, heard it all, and when the bank robbers begin to speak, he becomes very critical of their dialogue. He actually hears them effectively reproducing lines from bank robbery films that they've heard, and it causes him to make a fatal error. And that's when the second half of the story picks up. Excuse me. There we go. I had to get some tea. The second half of the story is what we're going to say taking place in bullet time. Anders will be shot through the head. And in the second half of the story, Wolff gives us a remarkable narrative. Imagine trying to tell a story that takes place in a split second. And what he does is to describe the path of the bullet through Anders' brain. And he writes about how the passage of the bullet through the brain sets off a memory, triggers a memory that Anders has time to witness. Before Wolff gets to that memory, he narrates many of the memories that don't occur. And that's a really remarkable way of characterizing Anders, by telling us what he doesn't remember, because it becomes a way for Wolff to show us what Anders' life was like, but also to sort of give a sense of where his greatest values lie. It's not that these memories don't matter, he didn't have a choice, but by noting that these are all the memories that don't get triggered, by the time we get to the memory that was triggered, we see it in a different light. Its importance becomes much, much greater as a result of the story, even though, as the narrator will note, it's a memory that Anders scarcely recalls. It's not one that he would immediately have thought was the most important moment, the last memory for him to have before he dies. And what I hope you notice is that it is a memory that points to a moment of freshness for Anders, a moment when the world was new and still had the possibility of unexpectedness. And that's what we end with. Our final story is by a writer named Donald Barthelme, called The School. This is a fabulous work in that there are some things that happen in it that are beyond the bounds of the real. It's not science fiction, but it's meant to have a kind of fabulous quality to it. You absolutely should not read this as a realistic story. If you did, you would definitely worry about what's happening at this school. But what you should certainly pay attention to as you read it is the quality of the language itself, and try to read it as a funny story, but a morbidly funny story, because it is very much a story about death. I mean, in short, it's about an elementary school and a science teacher at the school who keeps trying to instruct his pupils in biology lessons, trying to basically get them to raise and take care of various living entities, and all of them die. And it almost unfolds like a joke because of the way that there's a sort of mounting tension that results from the mounting levels of consciousness and personality of all the creatures that eventually die. And it ends with a really quite charming moment where the children, in a kind of chorus, demand some expression of value from the narrator. You know, in the face of all this death, they're beginning to feel that the world has no meaning, and they want something good. They want something positive and hopeful. And so that there's a kind of, I mean, you should notice that when the children start speaking as a group, they speak almost philosophically. That's not what children literally sound like, right? This is not, as I said, this is not a realistic story. But you should laugh at it. At the same time, you should realize how very much the issue of how humans relate to death and what that does to meaning and the way we value the world, what our expectations are, those things are all being challenged in the story. So this week we will be moving away from realism, and we'll start to see some of the ways in which short stories can explore different worlds, some of the ways that they can explore language that is not strictly literal, and certainly the ways that the language of the stories becomes very expressive of the meanings. You know, you will notice at the end of Barthelme's story, the narrator's voice is often very dry and ironic. When the children start to speak, they, like I said, sound philosophical, or maybe even like a Greek chorus. When we get to Bullet in the Brain, there's the straightforward narrative of Anders' experience at the line in the bank, and then the description of the memories Wolff gives us is lyrical. It's a really beautiful poetry of a human life. And then certainly with Butler, what you should notice are some of the intense moments of negotiation between the two main characters, between the Terran Gan and the Talik Tagatoi, and how if we see them as different races, not just different alien species, but as races the way we think of them in present day society, the way that their negotiation is indicative of race relations in this country. And so while it's not a straightforward allegory where Tagatoi stands for white dominant culture and Gan might stand for sort of oppressed segments of society, African American society in particular. I don't want to suggest that they strictly line up that way, but certainly the conflict between these characters is a kind of political and social conflict and negotiation that we're still dealing with and trying to cope with today. And I find the limited but very real peace that these two characters reach by the end is one that I continue to think about and turn over in my thoughts. So I will look forward to talking with you about these stories this week.